Chapter 7. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once. "Madeline! You mean my Madeline!" Cassandra cried, coming half to her feet. "You must be joking, Holt," said Horace. "But she's a girl!" That was Gillen. Holt waited until they all fell silent. Then he answered them calmly. "Yes, Cassandra, I do mean your Madeline, and no, I'm not joking, Horace. And yes, Gillen, I'm aware that Madeline is a girl." He noticed that, alone among those in the room, his wife had said nothing. He glanced sideways at her and was not surprised to see that she was nodding her head thoughtfully. He gave her a brief smile. The others were all still totally nonplussed by his suggestion. Cassandra had fallen back into her chair as she realized he was serious. He spoke to her now. "Evelyn," he said. Like Will, Holt usually used that name for her in private. It was a mark of affection between them. "Let's just think about something. If you had a son instead of a daughter, what would he be doing now?" "I didn't have a son," she began, but he held up his hands to still her protest. "Just humour me. Let's say, hypothetically, you have a son. How would you be preparing him for his future as the ruler of Araluen?" Cassandra bit her lip. She could see what he was angling at, and she refused to give his suggestion any support. Horace answered for her. "He'd be in the army," he said in a flat tone. Cassandra whipped round to glare at him. "Horace!" she cried accusingly. But Horace, tall, practical, and honest, shrugged at her. There was no avoiding the answer. Holt nodded gently, his eyes still fixed on Cassandra as she turned back to him. She flushed. He could see that she regretted the sudden surge of anger she had directed at her husband. "That's right," he said. "Probably in a cavalry regiment." "You would have trained him with the sword and the lance for the past few years, I would think, Horace." Horace nodded, a little regretfully. During the time of Cassandra's pregnancy, he had nursed visions of training a son to ride and wield a sword and a lance like his father. When Cassandra had delivered a daughter, he had felt a moment of shocked surprise. He had simply never considered that possibility. It has to be said that this was quickly overcome by a deep-seated, lasting pleasure at the prospect of raising a daughter. But he remembered those long-ago dreams now. Holt continued, "Probably be a junior officer commanding a squad, learning how to lead men in combat, how to make life-or-death decisions. And I would guess that you wouldn't insist that he be kept away from combat. You'd recognize that he would have to be seen as a leader who shared danger with the men he commanded. Maybe he'd be assigned to a term of picket duty in the north, protecting against Scotty raiders. Or he'd be patrolling the southwest coast, fighting smugglers and moondarkers." He paused, looking at the two of them. Horace was looking resigned, as if he agreed that this was what a son of his would be expected to do. Cassandra's lips were pressed together in a thin, stubborn line. What he wouldn't be doing would be sitting in a big, comfortable castle, surrounded by hundreds of men-at-arms, and never knowing what it was like to face danger, to pit himself against an enemy and come out on top. Gillen opened his mouth to say something, but Holt held up a hand to stop him. He knew what Gillen's objection was, but he'd deal with that in a minute or two. "So, why would your daughter be any different?" he asked. Cassandra's eyes flashed up to meet his. "Because she is my daughter," she snapped. "Do you expect her to go into the army and lead a platoon of cavalry?" "No," Holt said in a reasonable tone. "But I think joining the Rangers would be a logical alternative. She'd learn to command, to make decisions, to judge a situation, and come up with the right answer at the right time. As for the more physical side of battle, well, we Rangers have always tended to step back and leave that to the bash and whackers like Horace. No offence, he added with a small smile. Horace shrugged. I recall you taking your place in the battle line more than once, Holt. Holt nodded. I have, but it's not absolutely necessary for a ranger to do it. That was usually just vanity on my part. But even so, you admit that there would be danger, Cassandra said. Holt turned to her. Of course, we live in a dangerous world. When you're dead and gone and Madeline inherits the throne, there will be people who won't want her there. They'll have their own agendas and their own candidates for ruler. If they think they're dealing with a helpless girl, they'll try to take advantage of the fact. They might be a little more reluctant if they knew she was a trained ranger and had the backing of the entire corps. We tend to look after one another, you know. Cassandra considered his words. Araluen was at peace, but she was aware that there were still elements in the kingdom who would be ready to rebel at the slightest sense of weakness from their ruler. And any change of ruler could always precipitate a power struggle among ambitious people. Cassandra's own reputation and Horace's skill as a warrior were enough to keep such elements at bay. The people of Araluen were aware that their future queen was not one to be browbeaten or subburned in any way. Any rebellion against her would be quickly snuffed out. But Maddie? What would she bring to the throne? What would her reputation be? She saw now that Holt's description of her as a helpless girl was all too accurate. Of course, she would have advisers and supporters, but Cassandra knew that the true strength of the throne came from the ruler herself, from her ability, her confidence, her skill, and experience in dealing with tough and frightening situations. But still... But the danger, Holt! How can I place my little girl in danger? What if she's injured? She said, her voice miserable. What if she's hurrying to a needlepoint class, trips on the hem of her long girly skirt, falls down the stairs, and breaks her neck? Holt asked. You can't mollycoddle her. He paused, remembering his conversation with Duncan. Your father said that things are going to be tough for you when you inherit the throne, he said. They're going to be even tougher for Maddie. She may not find someone like Horace to support her. Holt leaned forward and took Cassandra's hands. You'd be placing her in the care of the greatest, most capable ranger Araluen has ever known, he said quietly. He sensed the surprise among the others and looked up at them. Oh, Will's better than I ever was, he said, smiling. Once, his vanity might not have allowed him to say that, but now the words came easily. Maybe not better, but certainly as good, Gillen admitted reluctantly. And he's younger, Pauline smiled. Thank you for that reminder, Holt told her. Then he turned back to Horace and Cassandra. Think about it. Could Maddie be in safer hands? Will loves her. He's her godfather. He looks upon her as his niece, if not his surrogate daughter. You'd be entrusting her to his care, and you know he would die before he let any harm come to her. And Will doesn't die easily, Horace observed. He was beginning to see the logic in Holt's idea. When he thought about it, he knew Maddie would be in safe hands with Will watching over her. Holt sensed the change in Horace's attitude. He pressed his advantage. On top of that, you've said yourself that she's rebellious and difficult. Maybe she needs the discipline that life as an apprentice would bring. I'm not saying she should do the full 5-year apprenticeship. A year should be enough, just so she wins her bronze oak leaf. The experience will do her a lot of good. Cassandra had drawn breath to reply, but now she stopped, and a thoughtful look came over her face. That's true, she said softly. She had a mental picture of Maddie back-chatting Will and finding out how such behaviour could rebound on her. Will would take no nonsense from an apprentice, even one he loved. Cassandra, Pauline said, and the princess looked at the graceful blonde, for a moment seeing her old friend Alice. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with your father when you wanted to go to Arida to ransom Iraq. I told him, and I'll tell you now, that a queen-to-be has to do these things, has to take chances, has to get out in the world. You can't rule properly from an ivory tower. This is a good idea all around. Cassandra found herself nodding. She came to a decision, looked at Horace, and saw the agreement in his eyes. As always, he knew what she was thinking. Yes, she said briefly. There is one small problem you're all ignoring, Gillen said. She's a girl. We've never had a girl in the Rangers. Maybe it's time we did have one, Holt said. Pauline looked at him with absolute approval. How far her crusty, grim-faced, traditionally minded husband had come, she thought. But, Gillen began. He was lost for words until he thought of an objection. She's small. How would she ever draw an 80-pound bow? And that's our principal weapon. I'm small, Holt said. So's Will. But girls have a different muscle structure to boys, Gillen said. He looked apologetically at Cassandra and Pauline. I'm not being biased against girls here. It's just a physical fact. In general, we're more heavily muscled than you. And Maddie is a slightly built girl. She'll never build up the muscle mass that you need to shoot a longbow. Well, we'll just have to find a way around that, Holt replied. Maybe change our thinking a little. On the other hand, girls are lighter on their feet than boys. She'd be excellent at silent movement and camouflage. She's agile, she's nimble, and those are all qualities that a ranger needs. He could see Gillen was struggling with the concept. He smiled to himself. It was actually an idea that he'd been nursing for some months. Not specifically concerning Maddie, but as a general concept. He had been aware that there was a current shortage of suitable apprentice candidates, as Gillen had mentioned, and he'd begun to think that the Corps was ignoring a potential source of such people. Half the 15-year-olds in the kingdom were girls. Some of them had to be suitable candidates. There were no female rangers simply because there never had been. That in itself was not a good reason. It might well be time to blow away the cobwebs and let in some new thinking. And who better to sponsor such a new idea than Holt himself? After all, along with Crowley, he had reformed the Corps many years ago. Maybe it was time for a little more reforming. As to Gillen's main objection, the difficulty of finding a girl strong enough to pull a longbow, Maddie was ideally suited to demonstrate an alternative solution. I wonder, could you release your daughter from her quarters for an hour or so? He asked Cassandra and Horace. I want her to show Gillen something.